We have a couple of things to go over today. One of the things I'm going to go over today relates to use of the use of the debugger, specifically relating to a problem that a number of students reported that I posted an announcement on. If you have trouble saving data, something like this. But in this class, I try not only to give you the right answer to a problem. I typically will give answers if I don't think that you have a fair shot of figuring it out yourself. You know, if it's something like, you know, you made a typo on something, you know, I expect you might be able to figure that out. But something like this was kind of a subtle error. So I gave you the answer right away. But I still want to show the process by which I figured out this the first time, because the first time I had a student had this problem, it was a little bit of a puzzler for me. So I want to show you the process by which I went through to discover the error. And that's using the debugger. I've joked in the past that, you know, the debugging technique that many people use is simply to stare at the screen and hope that the error jumps up and waves a flag and tells you what's wrong. But that rarely, if ever, happens. So taking a systematic approach is much better for finding errors. So let me demonstrate what the error is first. I go and run this. This, by the way, is a student's assignment. They gave me permission to show it in class. Go and add a category. Create new. Have to be logged on. I forgot about that. Let me go register. Type in a password. All right, click this little box to pretend like we got the confirm email and confirmed it. So now we can go and we can try to add category. So I click this, not quite yet, I have to log on. I never understand why programs that you register for a site don't automatically log you on, but I guess that's not the question here. Okay, so I log on. I go in and I type in a short description. So I'll type in BK, and the long description is breakfast. Okay, I go and click create, and nothing happens. It just sits there. If I go back to the category list, it has not added that category to the table. So, okay, what's going wrong? There's really no error message to speak of. And it's not like we're getting a database error that would explode and give us some kind of ugly error message. So we have to go in and debug. So in order to do that, I'm going to go and I'm going to open the page that is relevant here, and that is create CSS243. And on get is what happens when the page initially loads. And since we're not retrieving any data, all we do is return the page and display. On post is what gets called when you click the button. If we looked at the form, we'd see that the method of the form was post. So the on post gets called. All right. So partially, there's not a lot of instructions here. So we have a fighting chance at figuring out where it goes wrong. I'm going to put a breakpoint here. Now, what's a breakpoint? A breakpoint means that when the program is executed, when it hits this line of code, everything stops and you can sort of zoom in and X-ray the program and take a look at different variables to see what they are. This problem, by the way, I alluded to, I think the week before spring break, but at the time, it probably just flew right past. I didn't spend a lot of time explaining it. But anyhow, I'm going to set my breakpoint and then I run this. So I'm going to go and add category. Type in the values, hit create. It goes into that statement. Now, at this point, it is before the statement has executed. So we're sitting right here, and that if statement has not yet executed yet. But what we can do is we can look at the value of variables, and we can look at the value of variables a couple different ways. One way is there is this auto. Auto means it chooses the variables it thinks you're probably interested in, which is pretty fair, right? Because it knows what we're testing here, and we're looking at the model state and we're looking at the is valid flag. So, and we're looking at this page. So all those things are in the auto. We could also look at local variables, and we could also define items that we want to watch. But usually for me, auto does the trick. The other thing we can do is we can hover our mouse above a variable. And in this case, this tells me, I don't know if you can read it or not, but the model state is invalid. So is invalid is false. So if not is valid, that means that it is not valid. So it's not true. Then we simply return the page. And that's exactly what happens. We return the page, and we haven't done any of these lines of code to go and actually save the data back to the database. That's what these two things do. This adds the category that we've been accumulating in the model, and this saves the changes back to the database. And then we redirect back to the index. If you notice, a lot of times after we successfully add something, we go back to the list, which is a pretty logical thing to do. So model state is invalid. Well, we have to find more information about that. What is the model state? It is valid card attribute. What that does is that tells us if this is past validation rules. Now, we've talked about validation rules before. If you can enter something is within a range of values, you can enter it that it must fit a certain format and whatever. This also checks for foreign key violations. And a foreign key is when you're pointing to another table. If you don't have a valid value in the key that points to the other table, if you have a key value that doesn't exist in the other table, you'll get an error. So let's take a look at the model state a little closer. I really wish I could make it bigger. Hopefully you can see this. Now the model state consists of three things: index 0, index 1, and index 2. All right. And this shows what the check is and what the status is. There's 3 entries that are validated. And if you look, number 1, and number 2 are valid. This is the problem one. And the problem one is the fact that in the category, there's a list of meals. We could expand this and see more if we want to. about the values and that sort of thing if we want to. But essentially, that is invalid. Let's look at the model. If I look at the model for categories, you'll notice that associated with a category is a list of meals. All right. Now, we're entering a brand new category. Of course, there can't be any meals associated with it, right? Because we're just entering it in right now, right? We're not able to enter a meal until we have a valid category, in fact. All right. So therefore, how can there be a list of meals associated with this category when we're first entering it? Now, I would think that it would be okay to have a list that contains no elements, but the easiest workaround then is to say that this is optional. All right, so I'm going to say that the list of meals is optional. All right, I think that's going to do the trick, but let me stop debugging. And let me try it again. Go in and enter categories. Create new. Drum roll, please. I click create. We stop there. I'm confident this is going to work. However, if I wasn't, I would keep the debugging on just to make sure that I caught the problem. And sure enough, if we look, the model state is now valid. And those three things that we had, valid, valid, valid. In fact, there's only 2 entries in that list now. There's only 2 things that are validated. All right. Because we got rid of the constraint that there has to be meals associated with it. So I am reasonably confident that if I hit continue, there it is, and it got added to the database. I'm going to spend a second and look at the category again, because something looked a little funny. Okay, now let's try to enter a meal. Now that we have a category, we can enter a meal, right? Because there's a meal requires there to be a category. We couldn't even enter in a meal until we had a valid category. So let's go and try to enter meal. Create new. How much for an omelet? Oh, I don't know. Let's say $10. Category ID is showing as 1. All right. Now, it's showing as a 1 because this is showing a list of the valid categories. And I'll show you why it's showing a 1 in a second here. But 1 is not what we want to see. All right. We want to see the description of the category. Because, 2 weeks after you've entered the categories, you're not going to remember what was category 1 and category 2. But if you see the word breakfast there, you know that that's the category for breakfast items. We don't really have that problem because there's only 1 category. So I'll just click create. And guess what? The same thing happens. So you might look and say, hey, I've seen this before. Let's verify. Some in the models. I don't get some of the. Let's verify that the same things that work here. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to put a breakpoint here. Same place. I'm going to run this. enter a meal. We're stuck there. Look, again, entries equals 4, is valid equals false. So it indeed is the exact same problem. Let's look at what is invalid here. All right. This is valid. This is valid. This is valid. But this is invalid. Subkey, category, key. This is the meal category, relates to category key to the meal category. Well, let's see what that means. Look at the meal model. And guess what? They have the category ID as being optional, but they don't have this category showing optional. I would consider that a bug. And I have, because we filled in the category ID. There is a category associated with it. But for some reason, that, what's that variable called? The model state doesn't realize that there's a valid category there. So therefore, I'm going to go and I'm going to make this optional. I've seen other ways to work around this. This is the most straightforward. We are lying a little bit to the database because a meal should have to have a category, but small price to pay. So now I go and run it again. Try to enter a meal. We hit there. Now the model state is true. We continue, and we've indeed added it. Now notice also that it's showing a 1 here, which is the primary key of the category. The category that we selected is category 1. Now, we went over last time how to change this. But just to review very quickly, let's look at the drop-down that we create here. We put it in View Data, Category ID, and we're pulling the category ID, and we're displaying the category ID. We want to display not the category ID, but take your pick, short description, long description. Now it shows by name. And if we had more categories would be able to go and select that. Now, as far as this error goes, we also looked at it last time, but I did have a question about it. So in the interest of answering the question, I'll review it. Let's look at the index for meals. We're displaying again the category ID. We don't want the category ID because, again, typically the ID numbers, the primary keys, are meaningless to humans. All right, they're used internally in the database to connect things, but for people, usually we want to see one of the other fields that are more descriptive. So I type in long description. I now go and run this, and we get that displayed. And if there are more categories, we would see the more categories. All right. Now, the one thing I mentioned that I don't particularly like is that this drop-down defaults to the first category in the list. In this case, the only category on the list. Let me go put another category just so that we have a second category. Once you got everything working, be sure to take your breakpoints out. Now when I go in, I have a dropdown that has both of those. Now, the way this is set up, if someone is not paying attention, they're liable to accidentally enter in the wrong category because it just defaults to something. A dropdown has to have a value. I don't know if it's that way in desktop applications. I think it's possible not to have a dropdown where nothing is selected, but don't quote me on that. In web applications, that's definitely not the case. A dropdown always has a value. So what you do sometimes is you put a dummy value in there. So let's look at how you can insert a dummy value. And I know somewhere in this example, it's there. I just don't remember where. Okay, here we go. In the course insert. Notice that there's a drop-down showing all the departments, but the top one says select department. So let's look at the create for course, and we'll see how that is done. It's called a method called populate department drop-down list. Well, wait. I sure don't see any populate department drop-down list. Where do you think it could be? Notice that this create model extends department name page model. All right. So what they did, because there's a drop down both on the insert page and on the edit page, on the create and the edit page, they took that common code and put it in a model that they inherit these models for create and change from that model. So we look at that, and this has a function to go in and populate dropdown. It's the only function in it. But now, because we've inherited from it in both create and edit, both of these get access to that function. Oh, here. And what this does is this pulls, does the department query, orders by name, and selects all the departments. So that's cool. So we have a new select list that has department and name and selected department. Selected department is in case we have on a edit, we want the selected department to be the one that was chosen for that item, that course. So if a course is in the mathematics department, we want the mathematics chosen in the drop-down. Now, the CSS HTML, what they do for that drop-down is I'm missing something. Oh, right here. We've added an extra option to it that says select department. So all the options from that drop-down list will appear after that. So that's how we can put a dummy value at the top of the list. All right. Now on to something else. And what I want to show you is I want to show you an example of trying to create a query that is meaningful and provides good information. Like I mentioned before, some professors would like to have a class list. Now, a list of all the students that are in a particular class. So what I've done under courses, this is code I added myself, is I've added two links, roster and roster one. This is in this week's module, by the way, this week's example. You won't find that in earlier versions. Roster and roster one do the same thing. The difference is one uses the method version of Linq, and one uses the query version of Linq. So the manner in which I retrieve data from the database, the language that I use in the Linq, uses the two different methods. I prefer the method or the function method, or the method approach, however you want to say it. So if I click on this, this will give me a nice little list. And again, this is a very small college, one student in this calculus class that's in the math department and is taught by this person. You go and click this. Okay, this is a little bit bigger class, has these students, and so on. Now this brings together stuff from how many entities? Well, several entities, right? Let's see if we can figure out, if you had to do this from scratch, what entities. We need the course, right? We need the department that's associated with the course. We need the instructor or instructors that are associated with the course. So that's the third entity. We need all the enrollments for the course. Now we don't see that, but the enrollments is what links the course to the students. And for each enrollment, we need data from the student. So it's those, I lost count somewhere there, but I think 5 different entities we need to pull data from. So let's look at the code, and let's see, that's under courses, roster. Let's start looking at the page model. It's been debugging when I did this. I have course defined. My list is to get information about a specific course. That's all I'm pulling. But look what we can get to from the course entity. From the course entity, we can get a department. From the course entity, we can get the instructors that are related to this course. For the course entity, we can get the enrollments, and from the enrollments, we actually get the student information. So really, we're only pulling up data about one course. It's just that there's a lot associated with the course if you follow all the relationships. So we have our onGet method here, and it's expecting an ID. Why is it expecting an ID? It's expecting an ID because when we go and we want to retrieve a courses roster, we're retrieving a specific courses roster. We're not retrieving all the courses rosters. We're retrieving one specific course. Therefore, I have to tell it what course I'm retrieving. And that's what we do with the ID that is passed in the query string. If we run this, go to courses, roster, you can notice the status at the bottom, if you can read that. The Linq says roster ID equals 1045. And if you can't read it there, when I click on it, it passes the ID of 1045. How is that created? Well, if we look at the course list, the index page for it, when we create those links, we specify that we need to supply as a routing ID, course ID for both edit, details, delete, roster, and roster 1. The only thing we don't need to pass an ID for is to add a new item. Why don't we need that? Well, because when you're adding a new item, you're not pulling up a previous item. You're adding a brand new item. So don't need to pass the ID. We don't even have the ID yet. Okay. So we got this statement. The way I think about it is this. Each step in this process modifies, retrieves a list, or let me put it this way, we retrieve a list. Each step of the process either narrows down that list, sorts that list, or adds data to the list, or something like that. So in this case, I'm pulling a list of courses and I want the course ID to equal the ID that we passed on the query string. So I say where, for that course, the course ID equals my ID. So this effectively retrieves all the courses. This filters it down to only retrieve the course with the specific ID we're interested in. Include departments. What does that do? Well, when we say include departments, what that means is fill in the course object that we're returning, fill in this data. We have to explicitly say to include that data in order for this to be populated. We don't by default want to carry through all the relationships because we may literally only want a list of courses. We may not be interested in the department or the students or the professors. We might just want a listing of the courses, or we want the course and department. We don't care about the instructors or the students. So the include department says fill in this object in the course object that we're returning. Same applies for these other things. Instructors fills in this instructor collection. Enrollments fills in this enrollments collection. So at this point of the query, we have an object where we filled everything in. obviously we have the stuff from the courses, but we also have this filled with the department object that's relevant, this filled with a list of enrollments, the ones that are relevant, and this one filled in with a list of instructors, the relevant ones. The query is smart enough to know how courses and departments are linked, how departments and instructors are linked, how courses and instructors are linked, how courses and enrollments are linked. Now, this looks a little bit different. It says then include. When it says then include, we're not filling in something in this object. We're filling in something in this object, the one that's immediately before it. So when I say then include S students, what that's going to do is when it fills in this list of enrollments, for each enrollment, it's going to fill in the student. So now we have the necessary parts, right? The enrollment, we're not really displaying anything for. I guess if we wanted to display the grade, we could display something from the enrollment, but we're going to display something from the course, from the department for that course, for the instructors for that course, and for the enrollment / students for that course. We're not really accessing anything from the enrollments. We're using the enrollments as a way to get to the students associated with the course. So let's look at the CSS_HTML page. How do we refer to that? Well, we output the course title. We output the department name. Notice what this says. From the model, that's what model means, we're looking for something called course. Well, that's it right here, this thing called course, which is a course object. From the model for that course object that we retrieved, we want from the department associated with that course, we want the name of the department. We can do that because there's only one department associated with the course. The other things we're going to have to loop through, all right, because there could be potentially more than one instructor, and there could be potentially more than one student in the class. So that pulls up the course title and the department name. Here we have a couple of loops. And this says, for every item in the models, course, list of instructors, because the course has a list of instructors that we filled in, with that include, for every instructor in that list, loop through and display the full name of that instructor. So this is going to represent each faculty object that is in the list called instructors that's associated with the course. We do the exact same here. We loop through the enrollments, but instead of the enrollments, we want from the enrollment, from the student, the full name. And we don't have to write a nested loop in here because each enrollment only has a single name. So in this case, item becomes each item from our model's course object and the enrollment list within that course object. And for each of those items, we want the student, from the student entity, we want the full name. Now, there's one thing I sort of neglected unintentionally, but maybe it wasn't so unintentionally. I don't remember. I actually have redundant code here because I've implemented a where clause here, and then I've implemented first to default here. Both of these things filter out and select only things that have the certain ID. So I could actually get rid of this. And it should work the same. And there we go. Works the same. This is what I mean about making queries that are meaningful. Instead of just having a list of courses, yeah, that's okay. But this shows me for each course, a list of the instructors that are associated with it and a list of students. This is something that is usable. It would be effective to, or usable to give each faculty member a list of their courses with the roster. Now, roster 1 is actually the same thing. The difference being is we use a different syntax. Let me bring up the page model for that guy. We won't go over it today. We'll just glance at it briefly, and next time we'll look at it in more detail. This is code that looks more like SQL statements. And the one thing I could not figure out is how to do everything in one query. I had to have a query for part of the course information, then a query for the student information. But it gives us the same results. So this is one syntax to accomplish that. This is another. From my perspective, this is the easier one to read and to work. Keep in mind that meaningful queries are important. So think, if you haven't already, of what you would want to put in your project that would give me meaningful data, not just spitting out data that's in the database. If we look at our schedule here, for design, I think let's do next week. Let's do a week from this coming Wednesday. I thought it was due tomorrow. No, whatever I thought. Yeah, it's due a week from this coming Wednesday. So keep that in mind as you're designing this. Not just what entities I want to have and how to do scaffold stuff and be able to get a list and add, edit, and delete, but how I can take that raw data that I enter in and do queries on it to give me something meaningful. All right, are there any questions? All right, if there are no questions, we will either see you next week or in lab.